Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this morning's meetings, the topic of which will be an inspiration, at least, the auspices over the Roundtable, Labour Market Innovation, Danish Inspiration, are by Madam Michaela Opeltová, Member of Chamber of Deputies of the Parliament of the Czech Republic, and unfortunately she had to excuse herself this morning for family reasons. Flexicurity is closely linked to Denmark, where this model has been used for many years. So I'm very happy to welcome two guests who will share the Danish experience with us this morning. The Ambassador of Denmark to the Czech Republic, Søren Kelstrup, and online we will have a representative of the Danish Confederation of Trade Unions, Mr. Jobber Sørensen. And I also welcome Mr. Pavel Stern, Director of Business for Society, the organizer and host of this event. Good morning. And before we open the first block, I would like to ask the Ambassador and Mr. Stern to open this meeting by their introductory words.
Yes, good morning, everyone.
Dobré.
Thank you very much to Director Stern and Business for Society for inviting me here this morning. I think I speak also of behalf of Jeppe Sørensen, who will be with us a bit later. It's a very pertinent topic to discuss flexicurity, or rather, in this context, the flexibility of labor markets, because Europe, the European Union, has some challenges coming with labor markets. We have demographic challenges, more older people, fewer younger people. We need labor in Europe to continue to develop. And actually, in the recent foreign policy strategy of Denmark, democratic resilience was mentioned as a foreign policy goal. So with that, we mean that a strong Europe, a democratically resilient Europe, is a key condition for Denmark to have a safe world. So therefore, what happens in Czechia is also important to us in Denmark. We need Czechia and all other parts of the European Union to develop strongly and to have flexible labor markets to be competitive. And therefore, I think it's very nice of you to invite me here to discuss these topics today, and we will come back to the substance later. So thank you very much for inviting me.
And now, Mr. Stern, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome in the building of the House of Deputies. Thank you for dedicating your time to hear about the flexicurity topic. I would also like to extend my thanks to Member of Chamber of Deputies Michaela Opeltová for her auspices. Unfortunately, she cannot be here with us today. It's already been said. And I would also like to extend our thanks to the Ambassador and the entire Danish Embassy for their support in preparing this event, this round table. We had a similar event in 2018. We organized two conferences on the topic of flexicurity and Nordic inspiration. We invited their experts to Prague, so we're actually building on what we started to do some years ago. Flexicurity and Business for Society. Our organization is a platform for diversity charter signatories for businesses in the Czech Republic, and we are trying to promote topics of our signatories, of our member companies, promote their innovations and share good practice. And we're also trying to open a dialogue with public administration in order to share the practice and to lead a dialogue with the public administration as well. And this is very useful for the entire country. And that's why we chose the Flexicurity topic. Once you learn more about Flexicurity, you understand that this is a very inspiring approach that is worth discussing even in our environment, and it's worth thinking perhaps of individual features that are part of the model and think of their possible implementation in the Czech Republic, even if they would be just individual parts. So thank you very much. Enjoy the morning. And now over to Teresa Engelová. Thank you. So I think we can consider the roundtable officially open. And before I hand the floor over to the ambassador, I would like to briefly explain what Flexicurity is and why the Danish are so proud of it. From the information I was able to found, the Flexicurity model actually originated at the end of the 19th century. So it's been a long-term model actually. In 1960s, the model further developed. In the 1990s, the Flexicurity term was used first by the then Prime Minister in Denmark, and there is a so-called golden triangle: flexibility of labor market, social security, and active labor market policy. And in Denmark, the fluctuation of labor is the highest, and the structure of long-term unemployment is the lowest. And now the question is, could we also get inspired in the Czech Republic by this model? And that's the question for the ambassador.
Thank you very much,
Yep.
Ms. Engelová. Yes, that's a good question. Because each country has its individual history, individual structures, individual conditions. So obviously it's important to say from the beginning that the Danish model cannot be copied one-to-one, and I think that will be clear to you. But maybe, as Director Stern said, maybe there are some elements which could be interesting for you to discuss further. I will take you through the basics of Flexicurity, just to be sure that we are all on the same page, so to say, understanding what is it we call Flexicurity in Denmark, and what does it mean, what is the basis for the Flexicurity, what are the historic structural conditions. And then at the end I will give a short view on how I see pros and cons from a Czech perspective. And finally, I will present a very concrete example of an enterprise in a very remote part of Denmark, which is closing down these days as we speak. And I will try to take you through a few concrete examples of how does Flexicurity then work in practice. How do we actually close down a factory in a small town which employs 800 people and is basically a catastrophe to this local society. And then after that you will have a real expert, Mr. Sørensen, Jeppe Sørensen. He knows a lot about all the details, and he will be able to answer more concretely on some of the questions you might have. So, the Danish Flexicurity model, as you can see behind you, some of you on the screen, maybe you can, no, but you can see it up there. Yeah. You can see it here, good. Yes, you see there are three elements of Flexicurity. I think the two elements you hear most about is the flexibility and the security. So, labor market flexibility It's very easy to hire and fire in Denmark. And that's very attractive to the employers, of course, to hear that easy, no problems, no court cases, no long periods of waiting before you can get rid of an employee if you need for competitive reasons or for personal reasons or for restructuring reasons. Very easy to hire and fire in Denmark. I will come back to that. The other element, security. We have very high social benefits in Denmark, so your life, your family wellness is not linked to you having a job. Jeppe, you can correct me later, but I think the maximum pay you can get for not working, if you lose your job, you could get up to a maximum of about 60,000 Czech crowns a month. So you see, you can continue to have a good life even if you lose your job, and this means your safety is ensured because you get almost as much in pay when you don't have a job as when you do have a job. Of course, the higher job you have, the more pay you have, the more the ceiling will hurt you, because you cannot get more than these 60,000 Czech crowns, and this is before tax. In Denmark we pay a lot of tax, about 50% sometimes of the salary. But the basic point is we have this unemployment security, so that you can actually, as an employee, you do not have to fear being unemployed. You know that for at least a period of 2 years, you will have a chance to re-educate or to move to another place to find a new job without you losing your whole family security on the floor. The third part of flexicurity is not so much spoken about, but we will come back to that later. I will show you some figures, because Denmark is the country which spends most on active labor market policy. So this is activation of unemployed people. It's education re-education of unemployed people. It's on-the-job training, where you're sent to a company to see, is this something for me, or could I do a job here? Could I see myself in this new situation if I have lost my new job? And that's a very important part. So these are the three elements of the Danish model. So flexicurity, those are the three elements. The basis for flexicurity is what we call the Danish model. And as Ms. Engelova said, it's going a long way back. It goes back to 1899, when we had a labor market crisis, but where trade unions and employers agreed on a collective agreement to solve a crisis. And therefore we have this very long tradition of more than 100 years of dialogue between those who run business, the employers, and those who work, wage receivers, the employees. And therefore we agree on wages and working conditions, such as pensions and local conditions on the individual company. That's agreed directly between the two parties, first at the higher level, then at the company level. The government rarely interferes, so salaries are agreed directly, and the government can, many times when there are discussions, for instance last year when we had very high inflation in Denmark, 7.7% in Denmark, so not as high as here, but still the highest in Denmark since the 80s, created a lot of turbulence in our society as well, as it did here. And the Danes and the Czechs were actually the two populations in the European Union who reduced most on private consumption. So the perception of inflation, the perception of how there was a disturbance to the economy was pretty similar to here. So this trust between the employers and the labor unions goes a long way back, and it's very important to understand that we have in Denmark this common perception between employers and employees because of the tradition, I think. We have the perception that it's a plus-sum game to negotiate wages. It's not a win or lose where either the employers or the wage earners win. It's a plus-sum game. So if the company does well, it's good for the employees. And if the employees do well, it's good for the company. Because employees would then be more willing to re-educate, continue education, to work harder, to innovate. A lot of innovation actually takes place at the working place, you know. The people who are doing the jobs, they are the people who figure out what could we do more efficient here. So it's a plus-sum game. There is a sense of duty to reach the best possible agreement, both for the company and for the employee. So in good times you get higher wage increases, in bad times you get less. And actually we saw that in the spring this year, when in Denmark, as I mentioned, the private consumption was going down, the perception of inflation was very disturbing, the foresights for the future very uncertain, and then the government was saying all the time, we have to keep expenditure down, because if we don't, if we feed the economy with more money, then inflation will not come under control. So please be careful not to have too high wage increases. That was the message to the parties, the employers and the employees. Jeppe can maybe supplement me later, but I think we reached an overall agreement about 2% wage increase, and those money was even taken from the pension pools, so the employers would pay more in pension and the employees less. But this means it was a very responsible agreement, because it did not fuel the economy, and inflation in Denmark is now under, I wouldn't say control, but we have expected inflation this year about 3%, so it's pretty much close to the 2%, which is the goal. And this is because the model of trusting each other between the employees and the employers, that we have to be responsible in negotiations. We have to think of the difficult competitive situation companies are in, but also think of the very difficult situation consumers and wage earners are in. And therefore, that was the point of departure in this plus-sum game, which eventually proved actually to work, although many people thought these were too difficult conditions. So, just to sum up, flexibility, labor market flexibility, flexibility for the employer, very short notice, not more than 1 month. That's the notice you get if you're an employer. Then you must leave the job. And very low dismissal compensation. Many employees do not receive any compensation at all. I will come back to one example from Sæby later, where a guy had worked almost 30 years in the same slaughterhouse. He got 3 weeks of salary. That was the compensation for him after leaving a lifelong job. So very low compared to other countries like Germany or France. For the worker, the flexibility is of course also there. You can change jobs in 8 days to up to 1 month. You can say, I found a new job, better wage, better conditions, more fitting for me. You can very quickly leave the job. And as I mentioned, we have very high compensation if you leave the job. You get, for 2 years, then you fall down, and Jeppe can maybe come back to this, but you have at least 2 years with a very high security where you can feed your family and you can re-educate and you can find a new job. And therefore you see in this picture, you see that Denmark is to the far right. The picture shows the flexibility in the labor market according to the turnover rate. So the very dark color is changing from job to job, and the bottom color is hires from non-employment, and then the individual one is separations to non-employment. So those are the ones who fall in between. They cannot find a new job immediately. But you see Denmark very much to the right. Czech Republic is number 2 from the left. So you have a fairly low turnover rate here in Czechia. You need more flexibility, higher turnover rate if you want your economy to be more competitive and your labor market to be more competitive. So the unemployment security is also linked to being member of a trade union. 78% of Danes are member of a trade union and pay part of their salary to unemployment pools, which can then finance together with state finance, but it can finance from the trade unions these 2 years of unemployment. And as I mentioned, 90% of former income, that's the level aimed for. But there was a ceiling, as I mentioned. 60,000 Czech crowns is the maximum. So if you have a better salary, you cannot get higher than that. And then you have this time-limited inclusive activations, the 2-year period, as I mentioned, where you try different things to see if you can find a new job. And the financing, that's member contributions. That's those 78% who pay through their salary to the trade union pools, and then the general taxes, so the government. If you're not member of a trade union and you lose your job, you don't get as much money. You have to fall back on social assistance, which is considerably lower, but it's available for those 22% who are not member of trade unions. And then social assistance is not time limited. That's sort of the bottom salary you can get in Denmark. I believe it's around, it's below 30,000 Czech crowns. That's what you get if you don't have a possibility to get through a trade union, these 90% of your previous wage. And social assistance is administered by the local municipalities, and the financing is the general taxes. So, now to the third part of Flexicurity, this combination of flexibility and security, the government role. That's where we have a very active labor market policy and this system of training and upgrading policy unemployed persons. And I think this is a very important part of the Flexicurity, which is not so often mentioned, but it means that the state has a very active policy through the taxes, moves money to make sure that people get a new chance, they get a new education, or they get various opportunities to redefine themselves on the labor market. If the employees, the unemployed, do not comply with those activation offers, then the benefits can be lost. Then you can lose the 90% security. So you have to, as an unemployed person, you have to follow certain programs, and that's upgrading skills and qualifications, practical work if you are sent to an embassy to try to find a new job. And then, of course, we have also wage subsidies if a person who has maybe fallen out for health reasons or social reasons, then there can be, from the public side, a support paying the salaries for this employee for a period of time. So the companies dare to take a chance and employ some people who are maybe not fit for the labor market at the first look. But Denmark's public expenditure on these active labor market policy was 12.7 billion euro in 2019. That's for a country with less than 6 million people. And you see here, Denmark is to the far right. The two figures, you see the Nordic countries have dark red and orange, and OECD is green. Labor market policies, that was because of COVID. Still, you can see Denmark also compared to Finland or Sweden, which are on your screen. The Danish expenditure, the tax expenditure on active labor market policy is very high. This means that the role of the state in educating, re-educating people, in training people, in paying for involving the weakest people on the labor market and try to include more people on the labor market, those spendings are quite high in Denmark. Therefore, we have very low structural employment. So, Now to the pros and cons to consider for Czechia. The pros is if you have flexicurity, you will get a very dynamic and competitive society with benefits for the whole society, because the society as such will become richer through allocating the best qualified people quickly to the jobs where they are most needed. Because it's easy to change jobs, you trust that you can change jobs and life situation. You're not afraid to take big jumps in your life. And it also means that in Denmark's case, actually Danes are very supportive of globalization. They're confident that if for some reason we lose jobs in Denmark, then new jobs will pop up instead. For instance, in the 60s and 70s, in the place where I lived, in Jutland, in the western part of Denmark, we lost the whole industry in textiles to Portugal and Spain, and many thousand people were unemployed for a short period of time, but then new jobs came instead. And today we have a very strong design industry and other industries present there, so the unemployment is still very low. And then changing jobs, I mentioned, and in industry in particular, which is relevant to Czechia because you are one of the most industrialized countries in Europe. In Denmark, the flexibility is that 25% of employees working in private industry, they actually change jobs each year. So it's a very high flexibility. And then, as I mentioned, employers are more willing to take chances on people who might otherwise be left out of the labor market. This includes also immigrants, which we have quite a bit of in Denmark, who maybe do not speak Danish very well, or who are not educated for immediately fitting into the job, but the employers, through the support from the state and through because of the flexibility, they are willing to take chances on those. But also young people who may be socially challenged and other weak people in the labor market. Of course, the challenges for a country like Czechia is your government ready to spend, and do you want, as Czech taxpayers, do you want to pay more in tax to allow the government to spend more on active labor market policy? The benefit would of course be that you would have a more flexible labor market, because you could more quickly move people on the labor market. So you would have long-term advantages, but of course paying more in tax at the short term is maybe not what many Czechs want. Then also, is there a trust among employees that you can actually get a fair outcome? Do employees in Czechia, do you actually see as an employee your company as something which is a plus, some game for you? If the company does well, then you will also do better over time. Or do you see it more as a short-term transactional relation where you want as best pay as possible in the short term? And then the high unemployed benefit in Denmark. We had a discussion still going on. Does it reduce labor supply because people can, I think you say, work under the table? They can sort of say, I'm unemployed, and then they have 2 jobs on the side and don't pay tax and things like that. That's why we have the strong, since the 90s, we have a very strong activation policy and a shorter period where you can get the high income support. But it's a question which policies need to supplement flexicurity to make sure you do not reduce the labor supply. And then, of course, a precondition in Denmark is very strong labor union participation. 78% of Danes are a member of a trade union. They pays these fees to make sure that you will have money to finance the costly system we have. And then the demography. What does it mean that you have fewer and fewer younger people, and you need more people? What would you need to do? In Denmark we discuss immigration. We discuss, for instance, should we import Philippine nurses? We need people in the health sector like you do. We also need people in the social sector. So we don't really see how will we get those people without getting more immigrants. And here we have a challenge also in Denmark, because actually on Saturday our Prime Minister said, I think we should pay more money to the health sector people, the social care workers. As you mentioned, 4 categories of workers. And immediately there was a big discussion, because it's still going on these days. It was only Saturday she said it, but people say, this is not the Danish model. The Danish Prime Minister should not interfere with salaries and working conditions. That's something we do in the Flexicurity model between the employers and the employees. So you could argue that she is interfering by pointing to certain sectors that should have more money. On the other hand, at the end of the day, the government would, of course, finance those money in the public sector through the taxes. So maybe it's okay to point the arrow to where she thinks the problems are the biggest. So my point is, the challenge is demography. Also for us in Denmark, we are going to need more labor. We have a demographic challenge. So now, finally, I speak too much, but now I will very briefly sum up with Sæby and Cardina. I think those are 2 similar examples. As you may remember, looking at a map, Denmark has only 68 kilometers of common border with any other country. The rest is water. So if you live in the remote areas of Denmark, you are very depending on jobs being developed there. You cannot move to other regions, because then you end up in the water. You have to focus on your local region or move away from that region. And of course, we have a challenge in Denmark with that. We have what we call the rotten banana, was an expression some years ago, and that's the outskirts of Denmark all the way around. People move to the bigger cities. Young people want other jobs, and the many growth companies are settling down in areas where there's easy logistics and more labor force to choose between. So Sæby is in the very north of Denmark, and they have a lot of structural challenges, because fishing, in particular after Brexit, is not an opportunity for many people anymore. It's not possible to fish. Agriculture is also a constant challenge. Every year in Denmark, many farmers close down because the farms get bigger and more efficient, and young people don't want to be farmers, so that's not an option either. In the nearby region, many blue-collar jobs closed down. For instance, we had a big shipyard in neighboring Frederikshavn that closed down. It was a catastrophe for the local community. And also here in this by, Sæby, at the very north, about 9,000 people live in Sæby, and this slaughterhouse you can see on the picture to the left, it employed 800 people. So those 800 people plus all the service jobs related to it had to close down very quickly. The slaughterhouse is part of Danish Crown. Maybe you heard of that. It's a big Danish pork company which has slaughterhouses all around Denmark, but also in Germany and many other places. It's a global company selling most of its products to China, Japan, on export markets. But they need very flexible structure to be able to upscale or downscale production when the markets are good. And in this case, China was suddenly not buying so much pork meat anymore. There were not a lot of young porks to be supplied to the industry, so not so much slaughtering. And there was African swine flu in Germany. It meant also a crisis, so they had to close this down. And then instead scale up some of the other slaughterhouses they had in Denmark. But what then happened was that, first of all, the flexibility was there. From the moment Danish Crowns decided as an employer to close down Sæby slaughterhouse to the moment where it was closed, empty, it was only 3 months, 13 weeks. And as I mentioned, there were no arbitration between employees and employers. It was easy to fire these people, and even those who worked for their whole life in the slaughterhouse, they got low compensation. So easy to hire and fire. The security for the people who lost their jobs was also there. They got the money, the 90%, maybe some of them less, because people working in slaughterhouses were actually quite well paid. But they got at least this minimum support, which allowed them to keep up their life standards for a period of time. And then Jeppe actually was personally involved, I think. So the trade unions and the employers' organizations, they sat down in Copenhagen and said, what can we do with this very special case in Sæby, in the other end of the country? And they found some money to augment, to add to the money available for re-education and for various, finding various new jobs. So together in Copenhagen, the employers and the employees agreed at the national level to support the process that was going to happen in Sæby, where the local community was obviously in a shock. But also locally, at the company and at the local municipality level, activation policies and re-educating people was immediately started. And already now, we are just 2 months later than the actual closing of the enterprises. Already now, more than half of the blue-collar people working there have found new jobs or are in a re-education program. That could be even social care workers, but it could also be prison guards or other jobs that you can find for blue-collar workers. I don't know much about Karvinar, but I know that you have discussed for a long time this closing down of the coal company out there, and it's a very complicated situation. I understand it. There are not so many job opportunities out there, and I think therefore it can be to some extent compared to Sæby, because it's in the remote region of Czechia. It's very difficult to find other jobs there, and it's a catastrophe for Karvinar community that this whole region is hit so hard by structural change. So it's similar situations, and therefore I think that some of the elements of this cooperation between employers and employees, trade unions at the state level, and also the local cooperation with employment centers and various involvement from everybody to try to find new jobs for these people, and to also change their perception. Maybe what can I do as a blue-collar worker? Do I have to find only blue-collar work? No, maybe I could actually change and I could look after old people or something else like that. You know, you have to work with the whole range of challenges from employees to employers. Now I have talked too long and too much, but Jeppe, I think, do you want to ask questions now, or should we wait until we have heard Jeppe's presentation?
I think it might be better to give a word to Jeppe first.
I think also Jeppe...
He feels comfortable with the time limit and stuff,
sure.
If we have time. But thank you so much. Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. Pardon, omlouvám se. Přijdu do češtiny. Děkuji moc krát za velmi zajímavou prezentaci.
So thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.
Se dostane na vaše otázky. Je mi jasné, že určitě máte otázky.
Time is getting short, and I'm sure that you will have questions for the ambassador. Do not worry, we will have time to discuss everything in the second block after the break. So note them down. And now I would like to hand the floor over to the political analyst of the Confederation of Trade Unions in Denmark, Mr. Jeppe Sørensen, who is online with us and who is going to speak about how the Flexicurity system works in practical life and what are the experience of the Confederation of Trade Unions in Denmark. Can you hear us all right?
Tak, slyšíme se.
Can you hear us?
So let me just very briefly welcome you, Mr. Sørensen. Thank you that you are joining us for the first part of the conference. And I would just like to give you the floor now that you introduce us the Danish system from the point of view of the unions and the labor market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Am I going clear through? Can you hear me? Someone is nodding in the background. Thank you very much.
We can hear you.
I'm just going to start my presentation now. Thank you for the invitation to talk a little bit about the Danish labor market model and the Flexicurity model. So first of all, thank you for the invitation and the introduction. Thank you to Director Stern and to Mr. Ambassador for the very for the good introduction to the Flexicurity model and the Danish labor market model. What I'm going to try to do is to try to elaborate a bit on what the Danish labor market model or the Danish model looks like when you are the labor union or the social partners, and give some concrete examples on how we have benefited as a society in Denmark from the Flexicurity model and the Danish labor market model. But to start from the beginning, and I'm not going to linger on this, but I think it's important to sort of get the foundation of the Flexicurity model in place. First of all, I come from FH, the largest national trade union confederation in Denmark. We represent 64 trade unions and more than 1.3 million workers in Denmark, and have been a part of negotiations with employers, unions, and the government from, as you said, around 150 years ago. And I think it's important to say that the Flexicurity model and the Danish model has not looked like it is doing today for 150 years. It has evolved during that time. But there are some core elements that I think is important to sort of establish from the get-go. And I think that the Mr. Ambassador said it very succinctly, but the main crux of it is that disagreements is generally solved by negotiations. The idea is that both parties acknowledge each other's interests, which means that as employees, you recognize that companies need to make money and sometimes need to establish another labor part in the company, and that means hiring and firing. But employers also understand that their employees need security, they need qualifications, they need a work environment that they can work in. So that's, I think, the idea that you are not just an interest group for your own sake, but you are a sort of a societal actor who plays a part in the entire society, how the society holds together, how the economy is doing, is, I think, is very important part of this, and is something that has been sort of garnered through social cohesiveness and trust through many years. So in Denmark, we also have, as Mr. Ambassador said, a very high density of trade unions and employers unions. We also have a system of arbitration. I think that's also a very important element, that you cannot always agree, but if you do not agree, then you have a system that sort of picks the disagreement up and tries to arbitrate and figure out a way to reach an agreement. You have that both nationally, when you have the big tripartite agreements and the big wage discussions. How should wage develop and what should be the wage levels. But you also have it locally if there is a disagreement on how to use the collective bargaining agreements. So this is based on a voluntary self-regulation as opposed to legislation. And I think that is why we can now say that we do not generally have legislation on the labor market in Denmark. There's also a give and take with the government, many points of contact, formal and informal. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the points of contact between the social partners and the government. This garners trust, and it's not a trust that has been there always, and it's not a trust that is sort of unlimited, but it's compared to other countries a very high degree of social capital or trust capital in each other. Right. So this is some labor market scientists in Denmark, and I think they sort of very eloquently state how what is the Danish model and the social dialogue, what is sort of the crux of it. We don't have a statutory minimum wage. We have basic wage levels that are negotiated by trade unions, and then the final wage setting is determined in local negotiations at the firm level. I think that's also something that's important. Mr. Ambassador mentioned the recent wage negotiations about it was very difficult on how to set wages in the private sector on the basis of inflation that made it difficult for workers to go to the supermarket and buy the same things that they had been used to. Now prices had risen, so shouldn't wages rise as well? And that we made a negotiation, and then you get sort of a national cap on wages, and then you go out locally and you negotiate what should be on top of that. It's normally around the double that comes with local negotiation. This is also an opportunity for companies to be very flexible in how they set the wages in their company, which is important because companies are different and the sectors are different, and the concerns they have and the demands they have on a sort of global economy are different. So that makes it possible to be flexible in the wage. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the tripartite agreements between government, employer associations, and the unions as the customary way to make decisions. And it's not just labor market policies; it's also educational policies, work safety, and other issues. So this sort of garners a structure which has been formalized and unformalized through many years. This is sort of the picture today, and I've only sort of selected some of the most important sectors: labor market, business sector, and the education sector, just to show that the social partners are involved in all layers of decision making or sort of advising in Danish society in some very important areas. My point with this is to say that there's a degree of responsibility put upon the social partners, put upon the employers, the labor unions, and the employers unions, which sort of grows more responsibility that forces the labor unions and the employers unions to become more than just an interest group for the members they have, but also to take a larger societal responsibility. Not to sort of ignore this figure, but just to say that, for example, for the labor market, on the national level, we have a labor market council with the social partners who advise the labor minister on how to on different areas of the labor market. Then regionally, we have the Regional Labor Market Council. We have 7 of those. The Regional Labor Market Council around Sæby, as Mr. Ambassador talked a little bit about, was very involved in sort of making the strategy of how to get workers into vocational training or into another work environment. And then locally you have the job center or the A-kasse, which is the labor market or the labor union's job center, and they are focused on the individual level of helping people get closer to the labor market. So there are a lot of formalized structure around how to make a good participation between the social actors and the government. And these formalized structures also mean that you get a lot of unformalized points of contact between labor unions and the employers union. I used to say that one of the people I talk the most to are my counterpart in the employers union, simply because we have a lot of business to attend to in our work in the Labor Market Council, the National Labor Market Council. So you've seen this before, and I'm not going to talk sort of explain this further. I think Mr. Ambassador very eloquently talked about it. I just to elaborate a bit. This is the Danish model in its sort of when it's the finest. This is the parties or the interested parties, the actors who understand that they need to respect each other's interests. And this flexicurity model, when we talk about it in other countries, the easy to hire and fire bit is always very popular. But my point is that it doesn't really work if you don't have the interests of the employees at heart as well. There needs to be a security, a financial security, and also a sort of a toolkit to make sure that you get closer to the labor market as an employee, or else it's just you just lose your job and you lose you risk a social doom. So to be a little bit concrete on how this works in sort of in practice, I've taken 2 cases, a very unusual case and a very usual case for Denmark. The first is the very unusual case. And of course, you've also experienced COVID. The entire world did. It was an unprecedented crisis. It hit the Danish labor market and the Danish economy hard. But not as hard as could have been feared because of the flexicurity model and the Danish model, which sort of made good foundations for the Danish economy and the Danish labor market to land softly. What happened was that we saw an increase in unemployed people. We saw that graduates entering the labor market had very difficulty in doing that during COVID. We saw that the pandemic and the lockdown affected the Danish economy very differently across sectors. We saw especially an increase in number of long-term unemployed people, and that especially hit hard among unskilled workers. So how do you approach this problem when you have the Danish model and the flexicurity model? Well, we approached it by making 21 tripartite agreements, and that might sound like a sort of a random number, 21, but it's a very, very large number, and it's a Danish record on tripartite agreements. As a comparison, we have a government right now that's been in power for a little under a year, but and that they just made their first tripartite agreements. So 21 tripartite agreements is a very, very large number. The Danish government had some money, or said they would like to finance a sort of a soft landing, or how to sort of get the Danish economy and the Danish companies safely through COVID. But instead of sitting down by themselves and figuring out how to, they called on the social partners who did the 21 tripartite agreements, and which consisted of a number of different things. I've written some of the bigger things down here, but you can see that there's again the respect of interest for both companies and employees. You needed to increase liquidity for companies, so they agreed to do that. You needed to have compensation to companies that were especially hit, so they agreed to do that. But they also had an emphasis on education, vocational training schemes, and prolonging subsidies for people on unemployment who, for very natural reasons, couldn't enter the labor market when there was a unprecedented crisis. So that's the Danish model. Then you have the Flexicurity model. The Danish model were focused on trying to get companies to keep their employees, but give them economic incentives to do that, and to use the opportunity to give the employees vocational training or give them training reskilling that made it possible to become more green on the other side of COVID. Now, the Flexicurity model, of course, made it easier for companies to adapt to this shock on the global economy and on the Danish economy by reducing the number of employees they had, and some companies did. But then you saw that people were sort of caught by the economic unemployment funds and the compensation there, and you had the active labor market policies, which were lessened in the period of COVID. You could naturally not go on sort of work experience when the company were in lockdown, but you could still do online training courses and so forth. Now let's sort of look at the waves afterwards. Where are we now? If you look at the unemployment rate in Denmark, it's around 4.5. So we've lowered it. This is 2022 numbers. But the real important part, and I think the moderator mentioned this earlier, is the long-term unemployment rate, which is very low in Denmark compared to other countries. In 2022, Denmark was the EU country with the lowest incidence of long-term unemployment. Now put that up against the fact that we had troubles with long-term unemployment just a couple of years before in COVID. So one of the things Flexicurity is very adapted in is preventing long-term unemployment by activating people relatively quickly. And also, I think Mr. Ambassador had a very good point in it. Also enhances the opportunities for companies to take risks in people who are maybe a little bit further away from the labor market, because they know that they can they won't be stuck with an employee that they do not find productive in the long term. So that's part of that, and that sort of makes way for this point that I think is very important. Mr. Ambassador had a very good point in the fact that taxes have to pay for your active labor market policies in the short term. But this is the case of active labor market policies, or the investment in active labor market policies in the long term has a significant economic advantage. In the 80s, we had a structural unemployment at around 10.4%. That means that the unemployment, regardless of the highs and lows of the Danish economy, was at around 10.4%, or would always sort of move back towards the 10.4% point. Then in the 90s, we got the Flexicurity system, or the first time we coined the phrase Flexicurity system, a massive investment in unemployed people, and massive investment in reskilling low-skilled workers, in reskilling people with obsolete skills, education, vocational training, but also work training, getting wage subsidies for companies, and now we have a structural unemployment rate at around 4.4%. The rule of thumb in Danish economy is that if every time the structural unemployment loses 1 percentage point, the GDP gains 8 billion Danish kroner. So it's very much a investment that pays off. I can see that the time is moving rapidly for me as well, so I'm just going to go quickly about this case. It's about education. Just to say that this is a area where we've made many tripartite agreements along the years. This is the tripartite agreement that we made just a week ago. We allocated 360 million kroner permanently for adult vocational training. Employers were refunded some money they paid in earlier, and they wanted to focus on digital learning, so they were happy. And employees got improved possibility to change tracks in life with focus on green transition. So just a clear-cut case of education being also a point of interest for the Danish model. Now, these are my last slide, and this is just my takeaway points. The main advantage of the Danish model, the Flexicurity model, is the balance between flexicurity and security. And again, companies can have an interest in flexibility, and employees can have an interest in security. So this is how we balance that out. This is based on trust and social cohesiveness, which has built through 150 years. So that's paramount. That doesn't mean that you can't take parts of this and import it or translate it into Czech. I think you very well can, but it's just a sort of an asterisk around that you need to build formalized structures that can pave way for the more unformalized agreements. Agreements garner trust, responsibility grows responsibility. And then just some notes. Again, we have a unique active employment, unique active labor market policy in Denmark, which has the focus on both subsidized work and a job-oriented education, not just education to what you would like, but an education negotiated by the partners that is focused on the demands of the labor market. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there, say thank you for your time, and stop sharing, and give the word back to the moderator. And thank you very much for the...
Thank you. Thank you very much as well. I'm very sorry because we are running short of time now, so we will leave the questions after 11 o'clock for the second part of the discussion, if you don't mind. I'm sure that there will be more questions, not only by me, but of the other participants as well. So thank you very much for the speech, and I will say goodbye to you for another 15 minutes. Now we will give a break. So hello to Denmark. A potom Gabrielu Vaňkovou, ředitelku HR a komunikace Facility PBC. A potom mezi námi vítám Ondřeje Boreše, manažera Public Affairs České republiky. A za Českomoravskou konfederaci odborových svazů vítám pana Bohumila Čápa. Protože jsem slíbila, že tak jako, aby to byl takový most, to přemostění správné, tak ještě dlužíme 1-2 otázky panu velvyslanci a panu Sørensenovi. Já možná to udělám tak, že zkrátka se zeptám 2 otázky a je na vás, kdo z nich si vybere jakou, nebo jestli budete chtít odpovědět oba na obě 2. První mě zajímalo, protože vy jste, pan velvyslanče, zmiňoval velkou částku, kterou dánský stát dává do podpory aktivního pracovního trhu. Je to téměř 13 milionů eur v roce 2019. Tak na co ty peníze jdou konkrétně? Jdou na kvalifikační kurzy, jdou na ty benefity v nezaměstnanosti. Na co ty peníze stát používá? A potom druhá otázka je, vím, že Flexicurity částečně převzalo Holandsko, se inspirovala se Francie, nevím do jaké míry, ale určitě prezident Macron sám řekl, že se inspiruje dánskou zkušeností. Proč ale ne zbytek Evropy? Když přitom Evropa podporuje, nebo oficiálně minimálně zmiňuje to, že Flexicurity je něco, co jí může zachránit v budoucnu její sociální pověst, dá se říct. Proč ne další státy?
Europe's neck and saving Europe's social security in a way. Why not?
Thank you for those 2 questions. I think Jeppe will be better posed than I to specify the 13 billion Danish crowns, but in general you already touched upon it because you mentioned how it was re-education, how it was salary subsidies, and also other qualification schemes, and exactly how the 13 billion are split between the various posts. Maybe Jeppe Sørensen can help us. Concerning Europe, actually, Flexicurity, to my knowledge, is written into the EU labour market strategy. So it is something that the Commission and the EU member states see as a way forward in creating a competitive Europe, which in a world with more geopolitics, where China, US have their own big subsidies and big schemes to get competitive, Europe also has to be more competitive and have to develop and face a new world, a new reality on the global markets. So it is written into the EU labour market strategy, and countries like France and Netherlands, which you rightly mentioned, have taken some elements. But I think, of course, here it's important to recognize that each country has a different history, a different structure of production, different conditions, which cannot be compared immediately. So I would say that it's about finding those elements where you can seek inspiration, and actually where we can seek inspiration. Let me take one example. I mentioned the slaughterhouse in Sæby, in the remote part of Denmark. I called it a rotten banana, that's a slang expression in Denmark, but a problem where you really see young people leaving, where you have problems getting new companies settling in because they prefer to stay closer to the highway down south or to Copenhagen, where you have all the educated people. So it's very difficult. But what the state can do in its active policy is, for one example, to move some working places away from Copenhagen, from the capital, and then to the region. And one example was the administration of the Danish state. So, for instance, what we do at this embassy here in Prague, it's run in a big digital system, which is not anymore in Copenhagen. Now it's in Hjørring, not far from Sæby. So that was more than 200 jobs moving away from Copenhagen. It was not very popular, in particular not in Copenhagen. It meant that I think more than 90% of the people who worked in the administration of the state, they left the job. They stayed in Copenhagen, stayed with their families. and the job of their spouses. But 200 jobs were moved to Hjørring, and after some turbulence where you had to teach totally a new labor force how to do the job, then it actually works quite well now, I think we would say, this embassy and all Danish embassies in Europe. So that's just one example of how this very difficult problem of helping Karvina and helping...
But that's the state actually making the new jobs for those people who lost them.
Yeah.
But it's not requalification, or is it?
No, I'm confusing two things now, but I just do it to tell you why we also... Because you're right, this is not Flexicurity, it's not part of the 13 billion. I think Jeppe will get back to this. But I was talking more about the second question, about the EU, and about how each country has its own history, its own challenges, its own structures. For instance, Denmark must be the only country with so much water around. So wherever we have a special challenge in getting jobs to the outskirts. And that's why we are also seeking inspiration in Czechia and other European countries. How do you solve this structural challenge of youth moving from countryside to the big cities? How do you keep jobs create jobs in Karvina? And maybe the state can do its part there. So this was more related to the second question about why do other countries not have this flexicurity? I think we have all our individual challenges depending on geography, history, and so forth. But creating a flexible labor market in all countries is something that is in Europe's interest, and therefore it's also in Denmark's interest that Czechia gets a more flexible labor market, because we will do better as a European Union with an internal market, free flow of labor and goods. We will do better as a European Union if all EU member states end up with optimal structures in their countries. So we are all in the same boat, so to say, because of the internal market, free flow of labor.
Děkuji moc krát za odpověď. Pan Sørensen, já nevím, jestli nás slyšíte, doufám, že ano. Jestli byste chtěl reagovat na jednu z těch otázek, nebo spíše na tu první část.
Sure, I'd like to talk about both questions, but let's just talk about the first one. So the number is not including unemployment benefit. If you put unemployment benefit on top of it, it's much larger, of course, because unemployed people have the large unemployment fund. So it's not included unemployment benefit. And I think you should sort of see it as two parts. There's the administration part of the job centers, paying wages to caseworkers and sort of paying rent for a job center around Denmark. That's around half of the 13 number, and the other half is activation. And activation is understood broadly as education for reskilling, vocational training, but also as wage subsidies for people who need to sort of be reintegrated into the labor market, who for some reason or another needs maybe some months in the labor market. And I think there's some important sort of learnings here from the Danish experience. First of all, a paycheck is extremely important for human beings in our society. We have schemes that where you just continue with your unemployment benefit, but you are in activation at a workplace, and we have schemes where you get a wage subsidy, so you get a paycheck from your from the employer, but the employer just gets refunded from the state. And it's very clear to see that it's the latter part of the schemes that works the best. It works the best when people sort of get a paycheck and they sort of get a mark. I am now working as this. So that's what we use the money for. And then of course the discussion always is education too expensive? When you take people in the unemployment queue or in the job center, and you take them away from the job center and put them in education instead of putting them out into the labor market, that can have an effect on wages, that can have an effect on the sort of the labor pool that companies can access. So there's constantly a discussion on how expensive is education with regards to the labor market supply and so forth. And that's not included in the 12-13 billion number, but just to that discussion is very present in Denmark. And then I think with regards to the second question on why is this not more common in Europe, I think Mr. Ambassador very eloquently talked about it in his presentation when he said that that at some if you don't have the tradition of social cohesiveness, of trust between trade unions and employers unions, then you are less likely to agree to something that might in the short term be negative to you. And I think this opposition between labor unions and employers unions, where you don't have the initial trust with each other, can make it difficult to implement a very flexible strategy on the labor market. You say that France has it, and we've talked a lot with French delegations from the Danish Labor Union at length over the years, and it's one of the countries that's very interested in the easy to hire and fire bit, but not so interested in the making a foundation for the employees afterwards bit. And so we've sort of raised a finger sometimes and said, remember, it has to go both ways. But that can sometimes be part of the problems. And I think that one of the main issues is also the very, very large investment that the Danish state makes in active labor market policy. I think Mr. Ambassador had a cons list where he said, are you ready to make that kind of investment in Czechia? And I think that question you can answer better than I can. But that is sort of, if you want the flexicurity model with all its aspects, then you need also the investment in unemployed people and the reskilling of unemployed people.
Thank you so much. Děkuji moc krát za odpověď. Tak jsme úplně v ideálním stavu, protože teď můžeme se zeptat našich ostatních hostů. Je to něco, co bychom tady mohli aplikovat?
Ideal situation for now, in ideal moment to ask our guests, other speakers, is this something that could be applied in the Czech Republic, not in the French way, but is it something that companies would appreciate? Madam Martináková, I think this model could be applicable, but it would require system changes in our legislation, etc. So low unemployment rate, if I look at it from my perspective of a pharmaceutical company, pharmaceutical segment, the market labor situation is very complicated for us because it is very difficult to find suitable candidates who would be able to perform the jobs that we're looking for candidates. And the competition in the market is really huge. So once we hire a new employee and we educate them, and this may be a difference from the Danish system because in Denmark the state finances the education and the upskilling. But in the Czech Republic, this is the cost of an employer. And if the turnover of employees gets higher, it means higher costs for us as well. And this is not something that we would be interested in so much. So perhaps there might be some involvement of the state, and perhaps the pharma sector is not so huge for people to get requalified qualified to work in the pharma sector only, but maybe there might be some kind of sales positions, upskilling, training, a general one, and then you may assume that this person will be able to sell whatever, pharmaceutical products, cars, windows. So perhaps this might be an inspiration. Me as an employer, I might appreciate the state support in this area, like to qualify candidates or labor force for certain positions, provide them with some kind of general training. But we see that in Denmark, the three pillars, three key segments of the system, of the model, are clearly set, clearly defined and well established. So I guess this is something that we would have to do in the Czech Republic as well. And I will ask Mr. Sørensen and Mr. Jeppe for their reaction in a while, because now I will ask Madam Vaňková for her response. I agree. I think that it might be interesting for the Czech market as well, but the problem is that if people get trained, then we may lose them because their skills are better, their education is better, and there may be a company that will offer higher paycheck to them and we lose them. So perhaps we might more focus on the mindset of the employees. Like during my work life, I can change my employment or job or even the sector that I work for more than once. But this is something that is not quite common in the Czech Republic yet. So if you have a recruiter and they check a CV of a candidate, they automatically say, okay, this person has no experience in what we need. It would be too expensive to train this person. So we need someone who will be able to start working in the position straight away without any additional training. But there's something that we have in common with Denmark. All over the world, I'm sure there are many qualified workers that might satisfy the demand for jobs, for workforce in Europe, European Union, Czech Republic, Denmark. But the process of bringing these employees, the third country nationals, is very lengthy. You mentioned the Philippine workers. It takes a year before we get the permission for them. So it's a very lengthy process. This may work for the healthcare sector because the demand is stable there. But in the pharma sector, things are changing much faster, so it may not be so efficient for us. And then once the people, the third country nationals, get in here, the situation for them in here is kind of complicated because they do not feel automatically welcome. Even the state has got or has many obstacles that they have to overcome, like bureaucracy, etc. Well, I think this is a good point to discuss for sure. Mr. Bureš. Good morning. Thank you for the interesting presentations. They've been very inspiring. And I think that they've been very inspiring, actually, but they would be very difficult to replicate in the Czech Republic because you would need all the three pillars. You cannot build it on one or two of them only. And now perhaps we can say, or we can see what the state should do. We can understand the role of the state in the active labor market policy, and there's a room for improvement for sure. In the Czech Republic, we do not rely so much on workers from third countries because our company is in the construction sector, so we operate slightly differently. And the second question is, what can we do to support implementation implementation of principles of this system. I think the only thing what we can do is to perhaps voice our opinion and try to support this system, to advocate for it, but then we also have to ask what are we willing to do to implement the system, because it might mean increased cost. But on the other hand, the ambassador mentioned that if employee leaves a job, the severance pay will never be very high. In the Czech Republic, if a mine is closing, the employees will get 13, 14 monthly wages as a severance pay. So we know, or I know personally, what the state should do, but then we also have to think about how we as companies, as businesses can support this, and how we can support the dialogue or the discussion with the trade unions. And in Denmark, you mentioned that the tripartite dialogue is very important, so this would also have to be cultivated. I will also give the floor to Mr. Chap, so that we have all the comments. Good morning. I would like to introduce myself because I'm here instead of my colleagues who were asked to come to a tripartite meeting, a very important one today. So I kind of had to see what we're going to discuss today. My name is Bohumil Čap. I work at the International or Foreign Affairs Department of the Czech Moravian Confederation of Trade Unions, and of course we take part in the social dialogue with the partners. We take active part in negotiations, so I have some experience on the international level, but I'm very happy that this topic has been picked up at this level actually, and I'm very happy that there are so many employers to discuss this social topic, really, as I see it. And the biggest benefit, as I see it, is that when we say flexicurity, and we've heard it in here, people also think of flexibility automatically. And now, or this morning, we have also seen how much the flexibility costs, if I say it in play terms, really. And the flexicurity in Denmark, the model does not only mean that the labor code does not regulate everything, and we know that employers are interested in having the regulation. It's actually a model or a system that the Danish society evolved into historically, and this is something that we have to keep in mind, because the Danish model at Denmark is a balanced one, a balanced system, that, and we cannot really take just bits and pieces out of it. It would be very difficult. And I also mentioned that we can try to review or research if there are any conditions or if there's any room for us to make the market in the Czech Republic, the labor market in the Czech Republic, more flexible. I recall the graph that we saw that showed Denmark's investment as the highest, but based on the OECD data, Denmark spends about 2% of their gross domestic product on the active labor market policy. It's 2% of gross domestic product. The number sounds familiar and it's symbolical because it's the 2% of gross domestic product that we committed to spend on defense. So from this number we see how big a priority this is for Denmark. The Czech Republic spends 0.3% of GDP. And also in Denmark, the unemployment support is roughly 1% of GDP. In the Czech Republic, it's 0.15% of gross domestic product. This is also due to the low unemployment rate in the Czech Republic. So we have to take all these things into consideration and remember that the Danish model requires different mindset really, because it also requires higher or different structure of investment, because the society works differently. And we've just heard what are all the principles and all the parts of the system that come into play. And I haven't even mentioned the social dialogue. Thank you very much for your contribution to discussion. And I
Štern. A potom
we have the speakers.
Tak, pane Šterne, prosím.
So I will hand over to Mr. Stern. Thank you, Mr. Chap, for your comment. Just a contextual remark. After 1989, after the Velvet Revolution, new social security legislation was being adopted, and one of the first things was the different structure or a different system of social security insurance, because employees started to contribute to social security from their wages. And I do not know if it was 1% or 1.5% that was to be dedicated, of the amount to be dedicated to the active labor market policy. And the authors of the act at the time anticipated that this fund would be used to support the unemployed and to support labor offices. So people were supported to pay contributions to the unemployment benefits fund. But of course, it's a kind of complicated structure, because there's also a pension system that's part of this, and then you cannot really say that it's 1% of the contribution. In 2018, during the first Flexicurity Roundtable in the Czech Republic, we heard that in Denmark it's 15 to 16 billion. And it's not really little if we compare it to the average amount that we see in the Czech Republic. And after the reform of labor offices in the Czech Republic that basically just distribute allowances, it would be very difficult to labor offices to start doing a different work now as well, but it would probably be very useful if they started getting involved in the training and education. But I think the Czech system has really been set up right after 1989, and we are seeing some problems that this generates now. We have another question.
Omlouvám se. Budu mít dotaz na pana velvyslance.
It's a question for the ambassador, not just in terms of flexicurity, but the entire system. It is impossible to get just one thing, one part of the system. But I think that overall we can agree that this is a good thing. And the question that comes right after this is, where do we get money for this? And someone, or my colleague, mentioned that there's the defense budget, for example. Perhaps
Otázka na
Denmark
pana
has got
velvyslance.
higher defense budget, but the question for
Inspirovaná
the
do setkání
ambassador,
s velkou dánskou firmou.
inspired
Kolik je v Dánsku
by a
municipalit?
meeting with a large
Obcí,
Danish company,
měst,
how many municipalities
krajů,
do you have
vlastním
in
zastupitelství?
Denmark?
Za B, už tady zaznělo
Municipalities,
A za
regions,
C,
cities
s
with
tím
their
třeba v
own
rámci
local
DHI
councils.
nebojujeme, kdy říkají,
And in
ty
terms
otázky,
of the
máte malé
tax,
zastoupení žen ve vedoucích
of course,
technických
we often
funkcích.
hear that there are
Otázka,
not enough
jak
women
dlouhá je
in
rodičovská a mateřská v
management technical positions. But what's the length of maternity leave in Denmark, compared to the Czech Republic? Okay, Ambassador, could you please react to these?
Yes. First of all, just thank you for all the comments and questions. I'm also listening with great interest to the debate here. A general remark first, before I answer this question, would be that, yes, I have said it a couple of times, of course each country has different historical, economical, structural conditions, and it's a very fair point to say that Denmark has been a privileged country. We have not had the tough history that Czechia has, and in many other ways we have been sort of able to build over time a model. But I would say it's nevertheless the inspiration that might be a takeaway from this meeting is seeing the labor market also as an investment and something that will pay off if you invest in it. I have heard Danish CEOs when I talk with them, they have said, here in Czechia we don't anymore have Danes present. We have now found good Czech leaders to run the companies, and I think that's very true. We have only 2, 3, 4 Danes left here. Apart from that, it's Czech managers running, and the Danes say they're doing extremely well. They have a lot of capabilities, management talent, good relations with what we want to achieve as an organization. But sometimes these very good Czech managers, they do not see the labor force as something which is a source of innovation, development, something which can be invested in and then will pay off. Sometimes they are very eager to show the headquarters in Denmark or elsewhere that they are sharp on everything, including controlling wages. And sometimes that's maybe not the best strategy. Sometimes you could see labor as an investment, where you can invest in the right people, and through that, our experience in Denmark is, and Jeppe Sørensen must correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's between 80 or 90% of innovation in industry actually happens when employees on the job, because they feel part of a team and part of a company, they actually see some opportunities in improving production. So if you invest in employees and not only see them as something that should be kept in a short rein on the wages, now I'm exaggerating a little bit, I know that, but I'm trying to drive home the point that employees is an investment. Then there is a big gain on innovation and also for the country as a whole. Jeppe mentioned how 1% reduction of structural unemployment equals 8 billion Danish crowns, so close to 30 billion Czech crowns. So if you could bring down structural unemployment, then you can gain a lot for society. And I noted how you have received a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and a parenthesis here, I really take my hat off for what the Czech society has done in this regard with Ukraine. You've been a leader all the way. We are looking up to you in that context, what you've done with Ukraine. But coming back, it seems the unemployment rate has stayed the same. So it means you have some structural unemployment which you could reduce, because all these Ukrainians that have entered the labor market, they have not reduced the unemployment. And this means something is also for the Czech society in reducing structural unemployment. You will gain a lot from that. Just to round up on the broad comments, I think that we have a lot of challenges coming up. If you ask big Danish companies, they will say in 5-10 years their main core business will have changed. This is artificial intelligence. It's changing of value chains. It's a lot of things that are happening in the global markets and the preferences of people. So you also from that point of view, as a society, it's important that you try to find, like we have challenges finding, but it's important that we find sort of the resources in society to be more flexible, because the winners of the future will be those who sort of hit the jobs which are in the mega trends. So green transition, digitization, artificial intelligence, and taking the step up from being only a production country to being sort of a value creation country where the value stays locally is a very difficult step, but it's very important that the flexibility is built in the system so that you can adapt to these challenges that are going to be even bigger in the coming time. So therefore the relationship between employees and employers is very important, because it's the whole of society that must pull this transformation. Just to answer the concrete question of Mr. Prill, yes, we reduced our municipalities in the 90s, I believe, from around 300 to now 98. And you have more than 6,000 here in Czechia, so you have a lot. But I must say that my wife is from a small island where they had local democracy and 2 small municipalities. That was reduced to 1, and they are still fighting. Those 2 who got reduced to 1. And I think if you ask Danish politicians today if it was a good idea to reduce the municipalities, you will not get a clear answer. It's more complex than that, because sometimes local communities, municipalities, they are better off deciding themselves. So I cannot say that I have any advice for you on that. I don't think we have a clear idea whether it was a good idea to reduce municipalities or not. Of course, you can find some administrative reductions in money, but on the other hand, you can find more local involvement if people feel involved in their own municipality. On the maternity leave, I think you have a very generous system in Czechia with your 3 years and maybe even more. In Denmark, it's now, Anna, you have to help me. It's reduced to, as far as I remember, Jeppe, you will remember, it's about 1 year, but now it's more split between men and women. So it's mandatory to have some time taken by the men, otherwise you lose it as a couple. But Jeppe probably can answer this.
If it is similar to Sweden, then it's half a year, and it's divided between a man and a woman.
Yeah.
So that's Sweden, though. I don't know.
But maybe Jeppe, you can jump in here. You know.
Can I just supplement? Yeah, it's 12 months. It's a year in Denmark, and then you have a sort of a forced division between men and women, so that men take more of the labor take more of the time in the first year. So you can postpone it if you would like to, but men has to do it. Has to take 4 months, I believe, within the first year, and that cannot be transferred to the women. Which is it's actually a EU mandated change in Danish legislation. But that was also very difficult for us, simply because we do not have that in legislation. Well, we have some of it in legislation, but much of it is also agreed upon by the parties via tripartite agreement. Again, you have the partners sit down and they discuss what model would you prefer, and then they recommend that to the government who implement what the social partners think. So that's also an area where the social partners play a role. I don't know if I should talk a little bit about some of the other questions, or I think that just to touch down on some of the points made, someone mentioned the mindset of employees should change or should be different, and I completely understand that that point of view. And I think that one of the points that I've tried to make, and that I think that the Mr. Ambassador has tried to make, is that if you set up the structure to make it easier to be brave, then employees will be brave. They will take opportunities, they will challenge themselves, they will try to change track in life, they will educate themselves. But if you have children and a mortgage, then it's difficult to come home to the wife and say, well, we're gonna live on bread for the next 2 years because I'm going to take an education. So you have to have that sort of mindset. To change the mindset, you also have to look at the structures, or the formalized structures behind it. And then just a point about third country employees that was also mentioned. It's also a huge discussion in Denmark, how to import, or how much should we import third country employees into the Danish labor market. We lack qualified labor in certain sectors in Denmark. And that's, of course, also a discussion that the Danish trade union becomes a part of, and has to take into account the responsibility of the society as a whole, instead of just should we focus on our own members. And then just the point about the municipalities, or the many municipalities. That is why we in Denmark have a division into regions. We understand that jobs don't stop at the border of municipalities. You need unemployed people to move across municipality borders, even though you have job centers that are focused in municipalities. So we have 7 regions which are where we have participation of the partners, and that make strategic decisions on what do we want unemployed people to do in our region. What kind of employment should they seek towards, or what kind of education should they seek towards? For example, when we have an area, Esbjerg, which has a lot of oil drilling, or has historically had a harbor and oil drilling and a lot of oil people, and now we can see that maybe windmills will be more suited for that labor force, then that region is able to make some strategic choices in how to get vocational training to former oil drillers who are in the future going to work in the windmill industry. That's sort of an easy or banal example, but we have many of those examples where we can sort of adjust the active labor market policy to the region instead of the municipality. So that. Oh, and then just to, I think the Mr. Ambassador had a very important point about the quality and the qualifications of the employees in the company. We have this saying that every employee should be able to read a blueprint, and that's of course an exaggeration. But if you have employees who has to implement something from a blueprint and they cannot read it, then you have a problem. But if they can read it, and if they even can be critical about what the architect or what the engineer has designed, then you get a better workplace, or you get a better solution. So that's sort of a
Okay, thank you very much. Já se zeptám, máte ještě někdo nějakou otázku? Tak abychom to stihli, tak aby jsem vám nezabírala místo svými otázkami. Tak pane Čápe.
dominate the
chci jenom
scene.
krátce reagovat, když tady padla otázka, kde na to vzít, když jsme si teda řekli, kolik to stojí. No, Dánsko vybírá na daních o třetinu víc než my. Takže tam se na to bere, není to žádný kouzlo. A pak mě ještě zaujala otázka, co mohou firmy dělat, aby prosadili svůj pohled na věc. Aniž bych chtěl jakoby radit přes uličku, ale využít svobody sdružování, organizovat se a prosazovat to v rámci sociálního dialogu, tak jako prostě se to dělá jinde ve světě. Není potřeba objevovat Ameriku.
Já se ještě zeptám, jestli třeba dokážete představit, že by v Čechách nebyla stanovená minimální mzda, že by se to prostě nechalo na těch firmách a že by byly odbory natolik silné, aby si to byly schopné vyjednat v každé té firmě nebo v každém tom podniku separátně.
Já moc děkuji za tohle otázku. No, ono to je složitější. V Dánsku je samozřejmě víc zaměstnanců kryto kolektivními smlouvami, ale nejsou to kolektivní smlouvy vyjednané na úrovni podniků, ale jsou to sektorové kolektivní smlouvy. 80% pracujících Dánů je kryto kolektivní smlouvou vyššího stupně. U nás je to asi 8%. Čili v situaci, a to je to, proč jsem říkal, že Dánsko je jinde. V situaci, kdy 90% zaměstnanců je pokryto nějakou kolektivní smlouvou a kde je sociální dialog na takové úrovni, že jsou schopni se domluvit na věcech, jako je tamhle se zavřela jatka, dejme těm nebožákům nějaké peníze a na tom se shodnou se zaměstnavateli. Tak v takové situaci si to umím představit. Ale to je přesně to, co jsem říkal, že není možné si vzít jenom jeden aspekt typu zrušíme zákonnou minimální mzdu, protože to je dobrá praxe z Dánska. Tak bez dalšího se stane to, že prostě silnější bude ještě silnější a slabší ještě slabší. Takže představit to umím, ale za podmínek, které fungují ve Skandinávii, které panují ve Skandinávii.
Děkuji. Chtěl ještě někdo z našich speakerů tady reagovat na to, co zaznělo po těch vašich krátkých úvodních komentářích?
Děkuji, já vás teda s dovolením ještě předběhnu. Já nebudu teda reagovat, to si když tak necháme na později, ale
já už se nechám jenom jednu otázku.
Dobrá, tak já bych s dovolením ještě měl jednu otázku, jestli teda můžu z toho, co tady bylo prezentováno, podpořit předpoklad, že ty zvýšené náklady na pracovní sílu se neprojevily v tom, že by se snížila konkurenceschopnost Dánska jako ekonomiky, protože mně připadá, že právě ta nezaměstnanost je tam nízká, byť ty náklady na pracovní sílu jsou relativně vysoké, protože u nás vlastně je ta taková mantra v České republice. Samozřejmě čímkoliv zvýšíme náklady na pracovní sílu, tak tím ztratíme konkurenceschopnost vůči zahraničí.
Děkuji za tu otázku.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because that actually allows me to say that Denmark is the most competitive country in Europe according to World Economic Forum. So this means that even if we have very high labor costs, we are still attractive for foreign investors or for Danish companies because the quality of the labor force and the surrounding structures, including Flexicurity, that it's easy to hire and fire. You can easily adapt very quickly, and sometimes you need that as a company to be able to adapt to changing market conditions. So actually, according to the World Economic Forum, Denmark is the most competitive economy in Europe.
Pane Šterne, vy jste chtěl ještě...
Jen malou otázku na pana velvyslance, na JPho. Je to hypotéza, Ale z toho, co tady zaznělo, nebo co o tom systému vím, tak to na mě dělá dojem, že i vlastně ten systém jaksi toho dánského Silicon Valley, které Dánsko už několik let vlastně buduje, vytváří, že má systém Flexicurity, který vlastně jim umožňuje mít vysoce kvalifikovanou pracovní sílu a pracovní prostředí, kam teda proudí ty investice a ty nejlepší mozky, které Dánsko chce získat ve světě nebo v Evropě.
For the best brains worldwide or maybe Europe-wide.
Yes, I'm not 100% sure I understood the question, but you asked if the competitiveness in Denmark is strengthened by the system because we can attract good. Yes. Yes, I think that you mentioned the Silicon Valley. We have the Medicon Valley north of Copenhagen, and I think it's around 20% of Danish exports is within pharmaceuticals. So we're trying to build a cluster of specialized medical pharmaceutical firms north of Copenhagen in the Medical Valley, and I think that we have been able to attract very qualified labor from abroad for those jobs that are needed there. But I'm not an expert in it. But I would say, Jeppe, maybe you have also an opinion on that, on the qualified labor. I know that we have a big discussion in Denmark about whether we should be more flexible and more open to labor from abroad. Because compared to other countries in Europe, Denmark is a quite difficult country to get a working permit and to come from abroad if you're not an EU citizen. So it's a big discussion in Denmark. We have been somewhat more reluctant, and I think the employers would say that we need much more open societies, open to those qualified laborers. But the unions tend to have a different view. But maybe Jeppe can explain that to us. Thank you.
Yes, as I quickly touched upon, there's this discussion about third country employees, and we have the lengthy process as well as you have, the very bureaucratic process in getting work permit and getting sort of access to live and work in Denmark. As a labor union, the traditional answer has been that if you need labor, then you have people in the unemployment line. You have senior citizens or seniors who are sort of in the lasting stages of their work life, who has often difficulties in getting back into the labor market if they are fired. You have young people. We have around 42,000 young people who do not have a job and do not have an education, and we should invest in them. And we have people with disabilities that can also play a larger part in society as well. We have some schemes where we try to look away from the 37-hour weekly work week and try to say that if you only have the capacity of working 12 hours, then you should be able to do that. But all that aside, we also, of course, need highly specialized foreign workforce in Denmark, or people from a third country, especially when you say Silicon Valley, pharmaceutical companies. They need that, and we have a ongoing discussion with employers and the government about how to sort of make it easier to get people from outside Europe to Denmark. But it has to be in a way that is compliant with the collective bargaining in Denmark. That's sort of extremely important for us as a labor union. And if it is, then there's no problem. Then we don't sort of discriminate between labor. But it's an extremely important point, and I think that we will see a tripartite agreement on it in a year or two because it needs to be addressed if we want to keep the competitiveness for companies as well.
Thank you very much. So I have a last question, which in a way I just don't like to things end up negatively. That's why I want to ask it. I mean, it was mentioned here that either the whole Danish system has to be used with all three pillars, or rather not, because A is very expensive and so on and so on. But maybe would you, or that it's not misused, like you mentioned French example, but is there maybe what would be your answer to the fact, can we use at least something, or what is good to start with? I mean, is there something you can begin with? Because obviously you have been building this system for like more than 100 years. You must have begun with something. So what could a state which wants to at least start the path begin with?
So if I can try to start to answer that. So recently we made the tripartite agreement about vocational training or adult education, and the minister, the education minister, on sort of the eve when we made that agreement, sort of put his palms on the table and looked around and said, "Do we have an agreement?" And everyone nodded. And then he said, "That's very important, because that's the first tripartite agreement of this government. And we have some very difficult tripartite agreements coming up, but this agreement fosters more agreement." So my point would be that if you look to the Danish model, or if you look to how it works, the trust and agreements foster more trust and more agreements. You have to have a social dialogue that takes into aspect the interests of the different parties, and you have to sort of build trust that that agreements will be honored, and that takes a lot of time. But the willingness to sit down at a table, have a social dialogue with a binding outcome, I think is important, and that also means that the state has to have a degree of trust into that what is agreed upon will be implemented, even though it is not the politician that makes the rules. So that would be sort of an offset on the Danish model. And then you can say the Flexicurity model, I think you will only get the easy hire and fire bit if you offer something in return. And you have to look at how to make incremental steps into that direction by looking at how to offer education, vocational training, offer pathways to get closer to the labor market for the colleagues that loses their jobs. And I don't think there's an easy solution to that. My colleague from the labor union very succinctly referenced the number of collective bargaining, or the sort of the coverage of collective bargaining in Czechia as opposed to Denmark. It's of course that makes it more difficult to make agreements. But I think that would be my sort of ideas on how to cultivate a culture of dialogue, trust, and social cohesiveness, and try to sort of steer away from the animosity between trade unions and employers that you sometimes have in some parts of the world.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't see that you have headphones. So maybe if you could make some final words from your part, and maybe react on this. And who should start building the trust? Is it the companies? Is it the state? Like who is there at the beginning of the chain?
Yeah, that's a good question, and of course, again, the historical, regional, I mean, if we talk about Central Europe in general, structural reasons, there are so many reasons why you cannot directly compare, but what I do think is a takeaway is the trust that we have just seen described from Jeppe Sørensen and the trade unions. One step forward could be to see education and see each other, employers and employees, as a team. So it's not a zero-sum game where you look at the short term for salary here and now. It's a mutual investment in making Czechia a cutting-edge country where you keep the value in the country by reaching an education level, an operational level in the business, where you don't only produce a good, but you produce also a service and thereby have a highly qualified labor force. I think definitely you're in many ways already in that place, but it's a place where you could, I think this point about the trust to see each other as partners instead of opponents, where the battleground is what will the wage level be. So investment also from the government side and keeping the agreements and showing that you see everybody in the country as a resource. I think that could be the direction to go. But I realize that many Czech companies operate on very small margins of profit in very hard competitive conditions. And I know that the government right now is having to save money to get the state deficit down. So it's not easy, but one step at a time, and maybe that perception of seeing the long-term investment as a strategy, that is maybe something you can be inspired of.
Thank you very much. A já teď poprosím ještě Pavla o závěrečnou.
Thank you very much, and I will ask Pavel Stern to summarize and close this round table. Good. Thank you for the word. And first, I would like to thank to the ambassador, the Danish embassy, Madam Tatiana Pišvejcová, Lenka Andresová, for great cooperation and their support in organizing this roundtable. I would also like to extend my thanks to the member of Chamber of Deputies, Michaela Opltová, who was not able to be here with us, but the roundtable was held under her auspices in the premises of the Parliament of the Czech Republic and also Environmental Committee of the Parliament, because this is their room. I would also like to say thank you to our team of Business for Society who helped organize it too. Kamila Čubanová, she's sitting here with us. She's the diversity manager and deputy director. Then there's also Kateřina Eliášová, communications director. And of course, I would like to say thank you to all of those who participated and shared their views. And before we close this roundtable, this is not the last that we want to discuss this topic. We opened a dialogue with public administration, and apart from supporting responsible companies in the Czech Republic, we also want the state to, or the government to start talking to the companies about how the conditions, the environment for business should look like in the Czech Republic, how open work environment can be created in the Czech Republic. And it's been very inspiring for me to hear that in Denmark it is a general notion that the labor market has to be open and flexible for the employers to be able to be flexible towards their employees. And this is what the Flexicurity system is based based on. Of course, we can read a long discussion about how costly this system may be, but you probably know very well that once you set a clear goal and you set funds to accomplish the goals, then you can actually start moving forward. And we will definitely try to be heard by the public administration, so that the public administration understands that there are hundreds of companies that are interested in creating flexible and open conditions for their employees, and that the government, the state, has to support this as well, because it's not beneficial only for companies themselves, but also for the country as such. And this is something what we're trying to do in our organization, Business for Society. This is something that we will continue discussing. We will also continue discussing or referring to the Flexicurity model, and I would like to invite you to another event next week in the European House here in Prague. Mr. Ambassador will be with us, and we will discuss Scandinavian inspiration, and we will have ambassadors of Denmark, Finland, Switzerland and Norway with us. There will be Madam Eva Horolova representing the European Commission, and I think it's going to be another interesting event, because of course we will have our member companies there present for the discussion as well. So thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully we'll see you again next week at the Circular Economy Roundtable. Thank you, Madam Engelova, for hosting, for moderating, and thank you for the interpreters. Have a nice afternoon. Of course, we have small refreshments ready for you, and you can also have your photograph taken here with a banner of Business for Society. Thank you, and we're looking forward to seeing you again.